if you would recall, a lot of the programs that NUGS-Wuhan is engaged in has to do with the economy and how we would get a better understanding of the economic situation of Ghana. So previously, you know that we had the former Finance Minister, Setekpe, joining us to give us a lot of technical conversation. Today, the man that we have in our midst is not going to give us too much of technical conversation. It is going to be more of analytical understanding, using data and trying to bring into perspective the situation that we have and how we can fit in. So without wasting much time, we will start off with an opening prayer, which will be given by Philip Atitianti of John Nanyuo University of Economics and Law. So Philip, please, if you are on, kindly unmute and then give us the opening prayer.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's commence in prayer. Father, we give you glory. Father, we give you praise for such a time as this. We thank you for the gift of life. We are grateful for the opportunity to even assemble online to have this time of deliberation and discussion. We ask the Lord the event shall be a success. We pray for utterance, oh God, for our speaker. We pray for a favorable network. We pray that, Lord, may everything go as planned. This is the prayer and request of thee. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much, Philip. So, as always, we are privileged to have in our midst the National Executive Committee of NUGS-CHINA. So, I will simply go through their names so we get to recognize their presence in our midst. So, we have the President, Irene Koko. We have the Vice President, Thompson. We have the Secretary, Selom Adade, and then Gabi, who is also a member of NUGS-Wuhan. We have Seto Kwame Fujo, and then we have also in our midst other chapter leaders. Myself being the host and the MC for the program, my name is Samuel Yumasotu. And I would gladly call on the chapter president for NUGS-Wuhan in the person of Barnabas to give us the purpose of this gathering. So Barnabas, if you are on, please unmute and then go ahead.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think my task here is very simple. We all have been worried of late about our Ghanaian economy, that's our home country. And then we've been reading online and we've been seeing some comparative analysis by political party personnel, which we thought was not fit for us to just take it as a goal. So the chapter executive had worked tirelessly to bring an expert whom we all admire from a distance. We've all seen his approaches to national issues and how things are being analyzed from an angle of being an expert. So we did our very much best to bring him tonight to help us digest some of the problems that the Ghanaian economy is facing and how we can solve it. And I entreat all of us to just sit, listen, and then try to take notes. At least one day we are going to benefit from what he's going to talk about. Thank you. Samuel, I think I'm okay with that.
All right, thank you very much, Honorable President of NUGS-Wuhan Chapter, Barnabas. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, this evening is such a wonderful one, because if you have followed the speaker that we have on board, you would get to realize that he has in-depth understanding and knowledge, and he combines a lot of theoretical knowledge with a lot of expertise. He has massive knowledge when it comes to governance, when it comes to leadership, when it comes to management, and the whole lot. So I would want to introduce our speaker, but before I do that, I would want to read the topic for our gathering. The topic for our conversation for which we are gathered is understanding the Ghanaian economy, growth, fiscal stability, jobs, and stability. Sorry, fiscal sustainability. And I'm quite sure that the speaker will go through all of this carefully for our understanding. So we have in our midst a distinguished man by the name Bright Simmons. He is a social innovator, an entrepreneur, a writer. He is actually the vice president of Imani Ghana, Imani Africa, sorry, and he is in charge of policy and education. He also doubles up as the president of Pedigree. Basically, so far as you are a Ghanaian, he actually has had his education in Ghana, which is his high school education. And he's an old boy of Presbyterian Boys Senior High School, which is PRESEC. Now, as of 2013, he became the president of Pedigree, and then he is generally described as a social enterprise and an astute social commentator. Yes. He writes for Huffington Post, Harvard Business Review Digital, and Royal African Society's Only magazine. He also writes for African Arguments, and he is also a regular contributor on BBC's Business Daily programs. Now, in 2016, he won the Innovator of the Year at the All African Business Leaders Awards for West Africa category and All Africa category, respectively. In 2017, he was announced as the Eliasson Prize laureate and Thalberg Global Fellowship in New York City. Now, going through all this, in 2019, he received the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship on behalf of Pedigree. Now, as I recall all of this, you would get to realize that this is a man who happens to have a lot of capacity in our Ghanaian space. I have followed him, and I follow him on all social media platforms. He makes cogent arguments, cogent discussions. Himself and his think tank has been massive for Ghana's development. And for those of us who follow radio programs like CTFM's talk shows and then Joy FM's talk shows, you get to realize that they are often in those spaces trying to provide knowledge and understanding. So without wasting much time, I would want all of us to welcome Mr. Bright Simmons. And lest I forget, he's actually a married man. So let's welcome Mr. Bright Simmons. Thank you. So Mr. Bright Simmons, please, if you are on, you can please take over and then.
Thank you so much, Fifi. So I'm going to be using a presentation. That was the information that I received, that I'm supposed to make a presentation to set the stage for a broader discussion about Ghana's economy. Obviously, the subject of economy is very broad, so we will have to prioritize a little bit if we're going to be able to make progress. So give me a second, and I'll work the controls. I'm sorry, was that for me?
No, please.
Okay,
I guess
sorry, thank you.
It's someone who just joined.
Oh, okay.
And,
no problem.
And sorry, please, when you join, please unmute your microphone so you don't interrupt the speaker. Thank you.
Great. So if you give me a second, I will be sharing my screen and then commence with the presentation forthwith.
أخي وقفوني. هلو.
Unfortunately, it seems as if every time I try to share, something else interferes, some music.
I think the hackers have shared their screen.
All right.
Yes, I have to initiate a waiting room. I think the hackers are around once again. So
Okay.
yeah.
So Salom, with that, can we proceed? Is everything all right to proceed now?
Yes.
All right,
yes.
that's great. Thank you. Mr. Bryce Simmons, you can please proceed.
Okay, great. So I'm allowed to. Okay, that's good. Am I co-host now? Because I can see that I'm being asked to admit people into the room.
Please, for now, because of the situation, don't admit anyone. The secretary is going through some checks before he admits people into the meeting.
Okay, wonderful. So first of all, Fifi and the NUGS executives, thank you so much for inviting me to share my thoughts about the Ghanaian situation as far as the economy is concerned. Obviously, it's a very broad subject, and most people will be more interested in the current fiscal crisis and how that relates broadly to the economic management of the country. So I'll try and narrow down a little bit and provide us some perspective in that regard. And then hopefully in the Q&A, I will take my cue from the questions that come about what issues or what particular matters are of interest to the gathering. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, please. We can.
Okay, great. So as far as you can, most of you are aware, Ghana is an important economy in the African region. We are the #2 economy in the #2 region in the world. West Africa is the second largest economy in Africa, regional economy in Africa. And within West Africa, Ghana is the second largest economy after Nigeria. I think that is fairly apparent to everybody on this call. We've also had, as most of you will know, 3 phases of our development. And if you're using economic growth as the primary way of measuring, and economic development, we've had like 3 major phases. We've had a period from independence all the way to 1993, when democracy returned to Ghana, where fascinatingly we had very little growth as a country. And most people don't realize how, notwithstanding some of the qualitative measures of our country's development from independence, how stagnant growth was for the first 33 years of our existence as an independent country. It's quite remarkable if you look at the data. But for over 33 years, GDP barely doubled. We did very little GDP growth, and then population continued to increase. Then somehow, for Ghana, and this is obviously not consistent across the entire continent, but for Ghana, it appears as if our turbocharging of growth or our upsurging growth coincided with the growth of democratic institutions. Somehow, having moved into democracy, we seem to have actually increased economic growth. And that is not often what you hear when you listen to the debate. There's often the view that democracy hasn't helped Ghana very much. But unfortunately, that's not what the data shows. The data clearly shows that our upsurge in growth, or the witness of an upsurge in growth in Ghana, coincided almost perfectly with the return of democracy in 1993. But even so, until 2005, growth was still fairly limited. And the biggest upsurge in growth actually happened and actually coincided with 2 major trends. One was our ability to obtain resources from the broader capital markets, not being confined to specific sources of capital. And I will mention that again in a couple of slides down this presentation. The other thing that you realize in terms of the 2 major elements that have boosted our growth, which I'll touch on again, is the commodity super cycle. The price of some of our key raw materials, particularly gold and oil, have generally been on the upswing. The pricing have generally been on the upswing. And historically, we've really struggled with collapsing commodity prices, with irregular or erratic commodity prices. But for the last decade and a half, there has been what we call a super cycle in commodity prices. That does not mean that we've not seen troughs or low points, but on the whole, the price of those commodities have risen. So those have been the three major phases of our development. And the reason why I bring that up is because our prominence in Africa is primarily a function of growth that has happened only over the last decade and a half, if you think of it. So Ghana has not been as significant economically as we've thought, as we often think. Historically, a lot of our prominence now as the second largest economy in the second largest economic region in Africa is primarily due to factors in the last 15 years. And that is important because I'll come back to that. And you can see that in the bottom left corner of the screen, where you will see that all the way up to 2005, Ghana was not showing in the top 10 economies in Africa. And Ghana's entry into that club of large African economies is actually a recent phenomenon. It's something that has happened over the last decade. You can also see, when you look at growth dynamics, that while Ghana's growth is significant, a lot of the performers, the biggest performers in the period in which we are most interested, which is the 1995 to 2010 period, and that is to demonstrate that our growth performance is more recent. You see that the best performance of Africa in Africa in terms of economic growth from 1980 all the way to 2010. So basically, for the 30 years from 1980 to 2010, none of those countries, you won't see Ghana listed among those countries. You will see countries like Rwanda, Mozambique, Uganda, and others having shown tremendous performance. Ghana's surge is entirely a matter of 2010 and onwards, which is what you see in the graph at the bottom right. So there was the transformation since the production of oil, which coincided with the opening of international capital markets to Ghana, and our growth turbocharged to the point where we're at one point the second fastest growing economy over the last decade. So over a period of 10 years, we became one of the top 10 fastest growing economies in Africa. And then before then, we were not even ranked. So that is an important point. Our seeming economic success is actually pretty recent. The other point, because you also said that I should touch briefly on the issue of stability. The other point about stability that is also important is that Ghana's so-called stability is also very recent. If you look at so first of all, you put it in context, Africa is the most unstable part of the world. The number of coups d'etats or revolutions, if you want to call them that way, mutinies or however, in whatsoever fashion that you wish to describe it, Africa has had more than most. You will also see that Ghana is one of those countries that have quite a significant number of coups. You can see the red bordered squares are the Ghanaian coup d'etat episodes. So you can see that we're one of the countries that have seen very significant number of both failed and successful coups. So when people say that the risk premium in Africa is not warranted or is not based on fact, and it's just pure perception, that's not true. The facts do show that Africa tends generally to be quite unstable, and it also does show that Ghana is one of those countries that have seen the most coups or the most episodes of instability in the region. It's actually number 2 historically. So Sudan being the highest, and then Ghana, being the number 3 after Burundi. So I don't know, I got muted. I don't know when I got muted, but at some point I got muted. So okay. At some point I got muted, so I'm just going to repeat the last couple of sentences. If you look at the number of successful coup d'etats or attempts to overthrow the government that we've seen in Africa, and use that as a benchmark, Ghana is number 3 on the list of most unstable countries in Africa. Of course, we don't see it that way now, and that is because our last coup d'etats or attempts at overthrowing the government happened in the mid-80s. But if you think of Ghana as a continuum, then you realize that even that stability is pretty recent. And so that's the point I'm trying to make. So a lot of the things that make Ghana kind of important in the region, admirable, etc., are fairly recent. And we often don't tend to understand things that way. The other point that I also think is kind of critical is, despite Ghana's recent surge in economic growth, because we are coming from a fairly low base, given all the lost decades that we experienced in the 70s and in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Because of that fact, despite Ghana's growth, if you actually look at the raw numbers, let's say you look at consumer spend, which is what the graph that is on the screen currently depicts, Ghana actually is quite average as a country. So we have just $100 or something like that above the African average when it comes to consumer spend, and that reflects our ongoing attempt to become an important economy, and the fact that that attempt is fairly recent. So we are still not there yet in that sense, even comparatively across the African context. And it's the same if you look at other factors that are of relevance. You see that Ghana is often clustered very close to the African average, and you can take a number of important economic attributes, and you'll be surprised at how average Ghana is in Africa. The difference, though, is that because we are average on so many dimensions, whereas a lot of Africans tend to have more volatility across the different dimensions, our averageness has actually become an important distinctive mark, in the sense that it made Ghana very predictable in many ways. So it's stable enough, it has electricity enough, it has jobs enough, it has raw materials enough, it has, so once you have enough of those average attributes spread across a broad range of dimensions, whereas a lot of Africans tend to be more volatile, a lot of African countries tend to be more volatile in the measures that some of the measures that I've just described, it gives Ghana still an interesting distinction among the African countries. I kept saying that our distinction, our transformation as an economy, our emergence as an important economy in the region, I kept saying that all of these things are fairly recent. And then historically, if you look at it, Ghana has been a laggard in Africa, and it doesn't appear that is the impression people have, but that is the facts if you look at just the data. Why then was this sudden change evident about a decade ago? Most of that you can understand by just looking at these two graphs or these two charts that are on the screen right now. The first tells you that until sometime in 1993, sometime in 1990s, the early 1990s, most of our exports revenue derived from cocoa. So in the mid basically around independence, around 1957 thereabouts, as much as 75 to 70%, 70 to 75% of all our export income as a country came from cocoa. And then you move on to 2015 onwards, and you see that cocoa has now dropped to about 20%. So it's come back down from a high of about 75% in 1980 thereabouts to as low as 19% or less than 20%. That is the degree to which diversification has occurred. But then look carefully at the screen, and you see that more than 85% of our export income still comes from just three items: gold, oil, and cocoa. So yes, we've diversified away from cocoa, but we've merely diversified into other categories of raw materials, which in a way doesn't show that degree, a significant degree of transformation that we tend to claim is underway in Ghana. It's not evident in our export income. And if you look at around the world, you find out that one of the best indicators of true economic transformation is in export income, where countries are competitive. Because export is how you show your competitiveness. People only buy from you the things that you make better than them. So if you want to look at a country's competitiveness, the best place to go for clues is to look at their export composition. What are they exporting? Because that tells you what other countries think that country is competitive in. You buy from others what you think they make best. So if you look at Ghana's export income and you say, okay, you know, what are the things that people buy from us the most? You will see that, yes, we've improved from it just being cocoa a few years down the line, but only because we've added more gold and we've added more oil. It's as simple as that. That is more or less the summary of the economic history of Ghana in the last 30 years. And that is an important point to note. The other big story, so I was trying to explain to you why Ghana seeming distinctiveness in Africa as some kind of economic power, one of the top 10 economies in Africa. I've been trying to explain to you that it's actually a more recent phenomenon than we think. For most of our history, we were a laggard in the continent. Growth was very low. We're not one of the big GDP growers on the continent. And then in about the last 15 years, particularly the last 10 years, things have changed, and we've now entered into the ranks of the major economies in the continent. And I was trying to explain that two main factors account for that. One being a commodity super cycle and some diversification in our commodity mix, particularly when you look at export. Second is the story of our sudden discovery of the capital markets. And in discovering the capital markets, the increased attractiveness for inbound flows of capital from non-Ghanaians. You know, we call them investors, right? It tends to be, though, that it's in the financialization part of that dynamic that we've seen the most significant shifts. So it's not people coming in to build factories, you know, some of that has happened. So FDI has grown somewhat, but on the whole, the biggest story as far as this exposure to international capital markets that I say is the second most important trend, super trend to be aware of. As far as that is concerned, is particularly the area of financial injections in the form of credits to the government, sovereign debt. And within that sovereign debt umbrella, or under that sovereign debt umbrella, the Eurobond has become the symbol of this new Ghanaian attractiveness to international investors. So Ghana is now the largest Eurobond borrower in the world, as far as I have been able to verify, when you compare how much we've borrowed with the size of our economy, or if you compare how much we've borrowed per capita. If you use any of those dynamics, you find that Ghana is the biggest borrower in Eurobonds in the world and in Africa. So there's a very significant development. And that explains partly because we just started borrowing from these types of markets only in 2007. And for the, you know, for the first decade, from 2007 to 2017, we borrowed maybe 30% of our total outstanding, and about 60 or so percent of all the money that we've borrowed has happened since 2017. But in that process, that acceleration of borrowing, we are now distinctive as the world's largest borrower of Eurobonds, if you measure it in reference to our economic size or the size of our economy. So these are important facts to note to explain some of the things that I've been trying to get across. The other thing that is also important is the cyclical nature of these attempts to become important in Africa and the world by looking for a new source of economic growth. And I'm saying that over the last decade and a half, particularly the last decade, that source of growth that has made Ghana significant has primarily come from commodities, three main commodities: cocoa, oil, and gold. The pricing dynamics have also been favorable. And then on top of that, we've discovered these capital market instruments that we are using with great relish compared to every other African country. Okay, so we have people trying to take over the. So can you remove Kiajiman or whatever his name? Sorry about that.
Yeah, I've removed him.
Okay, thank you. So the question is, okay, how does Ghana find its source of growth whenever it becomes ambitious and wants to become an important economy in Africa? As I said, we've now successfully done that and become one of the top 10 economies in Africa. And I've said that primarily we've done that by discovering new commodities and therefore diversify our export base. And we've also done that because we've attracted capital in the form of Euro bonds particularly, but also other forms of capital. And we've gone to the extent of becoming the largest borrower in the world if you look at the size of our GDP. And given that fact, we can also remove Todd Peterson. And these attempts have often led to situations where we overshoot. So we discover a particular area of any particular source of growth. We go very aggressively and then we overshoot. So in the 60s, we tried to use supplier credit, borrowing, where we work with a particular supplier, let's say a contractor, a major contractor, and then they come in and build huge infrastructure, and then we owe them money because of the covenants that we made. And then recently we are using Eurobonds. But historically, when we've done that, we've often hit a limit. And the earliest was, of course, after the overthrow of the First Republic, the overthrow of the first president. We discovered that we borrowed so much to supplier credit that Ghana has become effectively bankrupt because we couldn't service our debts. We convened a debt conference. We are the first, as far as my reading of history is concerned, we're the first African country to convene a debt conference of this nature, to bring all our creditors together in London, in Marlborough House, and in that conference, try and get an arrangement that will restructure our debt and give us some breathing room. The British government hosted this on our behalf, brought all the creditors together, and we more or less managed to get about half of our debt wiped away or forgiven. So that was a very significant development. We also, and this is of course because prior to the overthrow of Osagyefo, the IMF had put together a program and made a proposal, and Osagyefo had refused because he couldn't agree with them on certain terms, and it had gone back and forth and back and forth. I think the most intense effort was in 1965. And then when he was overthrown, the new government managed to restructure the debts by simply not paying for a while. And then a debt conference happened in 1970. And by 1971, Ghana had succeeded in getting about half of its debt cancelled. These tend to be the nature of this cyclical transformation of our debt picture, not based on any fundamental shifts in the economy in terms of borrowing money, significant amounts of borrowing, and using that to transform the economy so we can now generate revenue that we use to service the debt. When we hit a wall, we just go to our debtors and our creditors and tell them that we've had these situations where over time, in 1974, 1982, we repudiate our debts. We technically default by saying that, look, we can't pay. And sometimes it's based on careful restructuring like we did in 1970 with the participation cooperation of our creditors. And sometimes it's been less sanguine. So in 1974, for instance, the famous Yen-Tuya period, it started off with a unilateral repudiation, the government of Ghana saying we're not going to pay our debts. And then over time, we managed to come to an agreement with our creditors and to restructure. 1982, very similar, but here, well, not very similar because here it was unilateral repudiation, but then followed with an IMF program, which often helps because what then happens is that they bring all the other creditors to the table and they managed to create a restructuring agenda. Then in 1999, we found out that we were back in the same boat. We overshot again. We borrowed money again. This time mostly from the multilateral and bilateral partners, basically the World Bank, the IMF, the big countries, and not from suppliers as we did in the 60s and 70s. So we discovered a new source of financing, and then we push it to the hilt. And when we push it to the hilt, we often find out that we are blocked, and we have to go back and do restructuring. And so that's what happened in the mid 80s. The IMF came in, they managed to restructure our supplier credit debt. This was also the same period that Nigeria had these oil warrants and all of these things that they were trying to restructure. And then in 1999, debt sustainability was back on the global agenda. The Cologne process was afoot. And then because of that, we managed to go into this thing called HIPIC. And by 2003, we have become the second largest recipient in Africa of debt forgiveness. So of all the countries in Africa, Ghana was the number 2 in terms of how much money that our creditors were willing to overlook or to wipe away. So we gained about $6 billion in debt forgiveness. People saying, okay, you can't pay, no problem. And that's it. And that process then led to some degree of, shall I say, loosening of the tightness that, we were experiencing in our fiscal space. So loosening our fiscal space simply meant that in 2000, by the time that we went into HIPIC, we were spending as much as 80%. If we were really going to service our debt, we were going to have spent about 80% of the money that we earned in the country paying off debt, and obviously we couldn't afford that. So HIPIC was just not something that was kind of strategic decision making. We had once again come back full circle and we just couldn't pay. So through HIPIC, we brought it down to less than 20%. Most of you who have been paying attention know that at this stage, we've gone back to like 50%. What that means is that 50% of all the money the government makes, it uses in paying debt. Now, if you look at it even more deeper, you will find that the cycle that I keep talking about, the fact that we go through these troughs and peaks, we are back to where we were in the mid 70s. We are back to where we were in the early 70s when our debt to GDP breached the 65% mark. What is important though, so if you look at what the graph on the left is doing, is telling you that when we've had restructuring of debt, our debt to GDP goes down significantly and then it goes back up. So after the mid 70s, when we had a restructuring, a year into and all that, it drops down to about 25% debt to GDP. And then it began the climb again right thereafter until around 1995, we were back to in the region of about 65 to 70%. And what you see on the right side is just a much more focused perspective from the 1990s onwards. So you see there that we are now back. Actually, this figure is only up to 2020, this chart, but you would see that we are now back to over 80%, which is historically significant because we've never crossed the 80% mark. You can see that even when we were really bad in the 70s, just before repudiation, we were still below 70%. So getting to 80% is a historical threshold. We've never done that, and that is where we are now. We are getting close to 83% in the next couple of months. Why? Why is really straightforward. I told you that two things accounted for our emergence as a prominent economy in Africa. One of them was the commodity super cycle, and the second one was that we discovered these new capital markets, particularly the Eurobond market, where we could borrow more. And then for some reason, we managed to aggressively borrow more than anybody has done in Africa in those markets. Once we did that, we were not paying attention to how it was changing the composition of our debts. So when you look at where, who has given us money, where are we borrowed from? You will see clearly that we've borrowed more money over time from commercial sources than some of our African compatriots. What does that mean? It simply means that whereas, yes, everybody's borrowing a lot in Africa, some of the other countries, they are borrowing more from sources where the interest rate is lower. So the debt is cheaper. And where do you get cheaper money? You get cheaper money if you go and borrow from Germany or the UK or from the US or from the World Bank or the IMF. Why? Because they have other things they want, right? They don't just want money. They want influence over your policies. They want to let their big companies get more access to your natural resource. Whatever it is that they want, it's often not just money. It's not just not profit or yield that they want immediately. So that means they are often able to give you cheaper loans. If you move away from that source of financing and move more and more into the capital markets, the commercial markets, where the people that are lending you the money are pension funds, are investment funds, are rich people, high net worth individuals buying your bonds. They just want money, so they charge you a higher rate. So you move on from something like 2% in interest rate to something like 8% in interest rate or 9% in interest rate. And because we have moved more aggressively. And I've explained to you that whenever we find a new source of financing that looks juicy, we go all in. So because we've moved so aggressively into commercial debt, our portfolio has changed rapidly. And that has meant, therefore, that unlike other countries in Africa that are also borrowing a lot, like Kenya or Burundi, that has a very high debt to GDP, our debt primarily comes from private investors. That really is the big issue. So it's like we have expensive credit cards and high interest rate debt, and we've lapped it up. We've gone in and aggressively grabbed it. And so if you look at Kenya at around 36% commercial debt, and you look at Ghana and you take total, commercial type debts, we are over almost double that of Kenya. And if you look at Burundi, very tiny. It's almost no commercial debt, like 0.something%. So that is where the reason why the debt situation has become so problematic, because the higher the interest rate coupled with a high debt to GDP, then the higher the amount of your budget you have to use to pay debt. And you pay both interest and retire principal. So in simple terms, we've seen a deconceptualization of our debts. If you look at it from 2009 onwards, and you look at how much of our budgets came from grants, which is literally money that other parties give to Ghana, and Ghana didn't have to pay back. And where do you get such money? You get such money from the World Bank, for instance. Sometimes they give you grants, money that you don't have to pay back as a country. Bilateral partners. So if you go to the UK, you are very good. Your foreign minister is extremely effective, and your embassy in the UK is really good at managing economic diplomacy. Then sometimes you're able to go to the UK and convince them to give you money for free. Of course, it's not entirely free, because it always comes with, okay, you want us to give you money free. Can you increase the parking slots of British Airways? Or can you do this? Or can you do that? But of course, it's quid pro quo. The truth, though, is that if you get the money for free, you don't have this debt problem as acute as we have it now. You have to consider the other factors, which is relevant as well. But I'm trying to explain right now, the focus being on the cost of our debt. And you see, therefore, that we've moved from almost 20% of all the money we get in the country being free money that other people are giving to us, to less than 3.4%. That's a very significant decline of how much free money we are getting from the rest of the world. The other thing I think, which has also led to this big escalation in debt and our unsustainable fiscal situation, is some of the delusions in the minds of our policymakers. We tell a great story in order to get this money that I'm talking about, this huge borrowing that we've managed to achieve. We tell a great story, and often that story has elements of some truth, but they're highly exaggerated or embellished. And you need simple stories to get investors to give you money. One of the simple stories we told was that, Ghana is going to become an oil power. We are going to become one of the biggest oil producers on the continent. And we started telling this story aggressively. We are positioned so well in Africa that we're going to be the gateway to Africa, and we're going to become a major services hub. We're going to build an international finance center. People are going to pour money into our country. All the Liberians, the Sierra Leoneans, are going to bring their money to our country to invest elsewhere. So we're going to become the financial hub. We tell stories like we're building massive infrastructure that will make Ghana the transshipment center of Africa. So you should read our prospectuses, the prospectus that we take into the international market to borrow these massive amounts of Eurobonds. And some of them just don't hold up. So this is just a graph that tells you that Ghana is not even one of the top 10 countries in Africa when we talk about oil reserves. I'm not talking about production, reserves. But we created this impression that, we're going to become a massive oil power. And we were saying it all over the world. So this was in 2019, when we're looking to start borrowing, ramp up borrowing again. We went to the world and said, look, we're going to be producing 500,000 barrels of oil by 2024. You know how much we're producing today? As those of you who pay attention know that we are now lower than 170,000 barrels a day. And it's predicted to decline, not to rise. So rather than 500,000 barrels of oil a day by 2024, we're going to make around 150, or we're going to produce around 150,000 barrels a day. That's really significant. If the managers of the economy think, or they are very, very inclined to believe, because they want to make themselves believe, that by 2024, you're going to produce 500,000 barrels of oil a day, and you end up producing 150,000 barrels of oil a day. That's a significant divergence from your narrative. So we tell these big narratives, we're going to invest 100 billion Ghana cedis into pandemic reform or recovery. we call it Obatampa, Ghana case. And so how much is 100 billion? What is that? It's like $15 billion or more. That's a lot of money. And so where is that going to come from? So, well, we can't tell you now, but just trust us. We're just going to put in $15 billion into pandemic recovery. And I don't know why we do that, but somehow we have these mega narratives. And part of it, of course, national pride. We're one of the proudest countries in Africa. And even though for many, many decades, that was not matched by actual economic performance, as I've shown to you in previous graphs. Now it's beginning to match up because people are beginning to take us seriously. As we keep saying these things, Ghana is special. Ghana is important. We are going to be an oil power. We are the gateway to Africa. And then sometimes if you discover an interesting segment of the market, which is a niche market, maybe a couple of, there may be 20 major global investors that give money to Ghana. It's easy to start to math, as we say in Ghana, math them to the point where they begin to believe, oh, this is probably true. This is like this unique, special country in Africa. Let's pile in our money. And that's what we've done for a while now. The other thing that has also emerged in terms of the important trends that have followed up from the discussion that we've just had regarding the transformation of the composition of our financing sources. The other thing that has also come up is that we've decided that we're going to become an important welfare state. But what you discover is that we spend a lot, but it doesn't really translate in the welfare gains. So if you look at Ghana, and some of the African countries that are also becoming welfare driven countries, we actually don't spend that much of our GDP on welfare, so things like free housing and things like that, though it looks like that. So we're better than Kenya, but we are worse than Senegal, Rwanda, and we are lower than the Sub-Saharan African average. That notwithstanding, you would see that we have rising government expenditure. The government of Ghana now wants to spend nearly 30% of all the money that's made in the country. That is significant for Africa. That's pretty significant for Africa. So the gross financing needs of the country is breaching the 25% mark of GDP, which means that all the money that we make in the country, the government increase how the money is made often means, therefore, that people don't have enough disposable income to give to the government. And that is a challenge that keeps coming up. I'm not going to talk a lot about taxes today because I just don't have the time. But that is an important thing to bear in mind, that the government is trying to do everything it can to grab more and more of the money that we make in the country. The other thing is that when we've spent the size of our economy. Now, if we compare that factor to what we've gained out of it, it's also not very impressive. So there's a chart of how countries' infrastructure has improved in quality over the last decade. And you will see that Ghana is pretty much average in Africa. Like I keep saying, we tend to cluster very close to the average. So we are very close to the average in Sub-Saharan Africa. We've not been able to really transform our infrastructure in a way that makes us a significant player from an infrastructure point of view. And that is an important point, because if you spend all of this money compared to others, you don't seem to have done that well. It can begin to hurt you. If you look at energy performance, for instance, we like to say that, well, we came out of an energy crisis and we are with a special case because though they have a lot of generation, they have a large population. So it's not really, sensible to kind of measure Nigeria in that sense. But this gives you an idea that Ghana's tendency to pitch that its generation capacity has really risen as a result of increased investment. You hear a lot about capacity charges and all of those things. It's also not borne out by the fact, we've done better than Liberia. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we've done better than Sierra Leone. But we've not really done better than Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, or Kenya, or our other competitors. And here, one of my pet favorites, and that is just how badly we spend on a value for money basis. How much more we spend than we should spend. So if you are buying an airport, how much do you spend? If you are running an election, how much do you spend? We spend double our next competitor in Africa when it comes to our elections, how costly our elections is per voter. So the average voter costs the Ghanaian state to exercise their right double what it costs in Tanzania, which has the second most expensive elections in Ghana. On the top right, you are looking at how much we spend on sports, particularly football, and you would discover that we spend way more on football. This is the World Cup and the AFCON budget, the Africa Cup of Nations budget. We spend way more than our comparators in Africa. If you look at our airports, how much we put into our airports versus elsewhere, it's unbelievable. I mean, we managed to do Terminal 3, the pride of our tourism and the pride of our hospitality industry. We say Terminal 3 is amazing, and compared to other African countries, Ghana is so modern. But how much are we actually spending on that? It costs $55 per passenger per year in terms of the investment that we put in versus how much it costs in Ethiopia to do better in Bali, which is their international airport and a true global hub, at least a continental hub. You know, how much we spend on our bridges versus, say, how much is spent in Kenya. So we've had situations where quite significantly, we are really overspending in areas where the benchmarks are fairly rigorous internationally. As you can, if you take a bridge, for instance, the parameters of measuring how much you go into a bridge are fairly standardized, you know, span, width, you know, things like that. And when you do those benchmarks, you find out that we are spending double what Kenya is spending. But my favorite is actually the Kumasi airport. It's like, it's been unbelievable. I have gone to that airport a number of times, and you will not believe that we've spent almost $200 million in that place, because it's almost mind-boggling when you walk in there. And you have this new terminal that is going to, you know, take our capacity to maybe 800,000 passengers. But by the time we are through, we'll have spent almost $300 million on that airport. And Togo has spent $150 million. And when I go to Lomé, I see a real international airport. And when I go to Kumasi, it's obvious by just looking at the place that this is not a place that has absorbed $200 million. It's unbelievable. And we've, you know, people don't realize, but we cut the sword to do the international airport in Kumasi in 2015. And we're supposed to be, supposed to be done by 2018. We have spent a lot of money on it already. In fact, we have spent more money renovating the runway in Kumasi in 2016 than Ethiopia has spent building Hawassa airports. But we wanted to spend more because we wanted to make it a true international airport, handle medium-bodied aircraft. And we said we're going to do that by 2018. It's now 2022, and we are still not done in Kumasi. In fact, the contractor went to Parliament and said to Parliament that rather than phase 3 happen after we've, commissioned phase 2 and started using the airport and generating some revenue, phase 3 has to start immediately, because for some reason, the airport has been designed such that phase 2 is not viable. It's like once we finish spending that money and we give you phase 2, you'll still not be able to use the airport, because we made some mistakes and we did not anticipate that where the watchtower is or the control tower is, it's not up to international, some crazy stuff. And so because of that, phase 3 has to happen immediately, and we have to start spending all the money that was budgeted for phase 3 right away. And that was the only way we're going to be able to get you an airport that you can use. So we are still waiting for them to commission that international airport. But I bet you when you go there and you look at it, it is not worth $300 million. Of that cost inflation, in a way, I think maps a lot of governance issues that we often don't talk about a lot in Ghana. One of them being the nature of the civil service we have, the public service we have, the quality of it. And you can see that from the governance index, effectiveness index that the World Bank produces. You can see that countries like Togo are seeing a significant rise. You can see that countries like Kenya, notwithstanding all the corruption accusations that we often make about Kenya, has actually been rising. Rwanda has risen significantly in government effectiveness. Ghana is literally stagnant. We are exactly where we are in 2000. So in 22 years, we've not really been able to improve the governance effectiveness. And that is obviously very, very, very critical. We have a situation where it affects us in some funny kind of ways. We recently decided we're going to significantly reform our power sector using American money. The Americans were going to give us maybe in total about $1 billion over a number of years through the Power Africa program. And we had about $500 million at stake to help make distribution effective through GCG, semi-privatization. And then we bungled it in ways that most of you are familiar with, very obscure, very, very bizarre ways, and through that effort, it was evident that our governance institutions were not strong enough, because how do you do a privatization and then eventually come back and say the entity that won after long process of tendering was actually some kind of scammer, which is what we told the world. We said, look, these guys that we give them our national asset, they are scammers. We can't leave it in their hands. But what were we doing with all the due diligence before you handed over the asset to them? And so these kind of things reflect what we can summarize as economic, social, governance challenges, ESG challenges. And those ESG challenges sometimes can be reflected in how much we spend on monitoring and evaluation. So if you look at the famous MIDA problem, so MIDA was the organization that we set up to help us execute the Millennium Challenge grant from the Americans, which was primarily going to be used in the power sector. And I was looking at, how much MIDA had budgeted for compliance, or, for governance. And I was stunned to realize very rapidly that they were spending very little on monitoring and evaluation, about $450,000 in training, something in the region of $900,000 in monitoring. Why is that too low? That's too low because we are talking of $1 billion program. You can't have monitoring and evaluation that is less than 1% in such a massive undertaking. You need to invest some money in making sure that monitoring and evaluation is going on. The other thing is that government likes to blame COVID, so that this is just offhand. But it's hard to justify COVID, as one of the major contributory factors when Ghana did not lock down as intensely as other countries did. Some of you are aware that in Uganda, they are only now opening schools. So if you're talking of impact, Ghana is one of the countries that did the least when it comes to actions that could have really messed up the economy. Of course, we spent some money in social relief, but as I've shown you previously, we didn't spend more than other African countries. We spend less than the continental average. And then when it comes to how much we hit our economy by restricting movement and things like that, we are among the lowest in the world, literally. So we can also say that COVID was a major challenge. What about the government's, argument that they want to reduce revenue expenditure by 20%? Do investors believe it? Is it feasible? Well, what two things, right? What our currency, what we are seeing in the dynamics in our currency, the movements in our currency, and what we are seeing in terms of how our debt is being treated, and which you judge that by looking at the spreads on the bonds that people have sold. So people buy debt from us, and then they can sell it on. If people are not willing to buy that debt for the same amount that was paid by those that initially lent the money to us, then you can tell that people are judging that our likelihood to pay is low. So that's what we call a spread. And if you look at the spreads on our debt, our bonds, you will see that investors are not taking us seriously. They don't take the government's fiscal consolidation pledge very seriously. And the reason they don't is because of the way it was announced. They said they're going to cut 20% across the board. You can't cut 20% across the board. Some investment, some expenditure categories are what you might call rigid. So, for instance, in the area of let's say wages and salaries, you can't just wake up tomorrow and cut 20%. It's a civil service. We don't cut the salary of civil servants. You only do so through negotiations, and it's never going to happen because they always expect their salary to go up. You can't cut expenditure in areas where you don't have discretionary room. And in a lot of the areas where you don't have, in a lot of the areas in the economy, we borrow to sustain. So how do you cut when you are borrowing to actually keep it going? It's not possible to cut something by 20% when you have to borrow by 20% more resources in order to keep that thing going. So if about 80% of our budget is basically fixed, and then the rest of your discretionary income is within 20%, and within that 20%, a bunch of them are covenanted in the sense that you've already signed the contracts and people have already started delivering, where is the room to cut 20%? You can say, maybe I'm not going to borrow 20% because, you run your country, you run a fiscal deficit, you need to borrow to keep your country running. So if the only thing that may be credible is that we're going to cut our borrowing. But the government never says that in clear terms, because when you look at the government's borrowing schedule and the rest of it, it's not evident to us, even how much they want to spend this year, that they intend to really cut borrowing. So they say they want to cut the budget itself, but you have very little room to cut the budget. Then the e-levy. Well, the e-levy situation is very much that political reasons force the government to introduce exemptions and to introduce room for people not to be so bitten But in so doing, they also lose some revenue. And then they impose revenue, a burden on production rather than consumption, because the e-levy does not discriminate between the two. Usually taxes are fairly efficient in discriminating between what is production and what is consumption. So if you look at income tax for corporates, it typically falls upon production. Now, because of that, we often don't raise income tax on companies as much as we raise we raise consumption taxes, because we want to incentivize production. E-levy doesn't know the difference, right? If I'm buying plantains for my Kilewele shop and I'm paying by mobile money or I'm paying by bank transfer, it just charges 1.5%. But if I'm also buying a luxury watch, it still charges 1.5%. So that lack of discrimination between production and consumption means that e-levy is merely contributing to inflation in production cycles. So people that are making items or making stuff to sell, they will experience a lot of e-levy if they run formal enterprises, and therefore they cannot pay by cash. If you cannot pay your suppliers by cash because you run a big business, and in a big business, it's very difficult to revert to a cash kind of model. Then in those instances, we think that e-levy will contribute to inflation, which is not necessarily, bad for fiscal consolidation per se, except that by so doing, they can lead to a displacement of taxes because companies are less productive, so they are paying less tax. And then because people are also, their sentiment is being hit, they may be consuming less and therefore paying less consumption taxes. So when you take the overall portfolio of taxes, you may find out that even if you increase e-levy by a certain percentage, or rather you increase it by a certain percentage through e-levy collections, it can also fall by a certain percentage due to the impact of e-levy, the cross impact of e-levy on other categories of tax. In simple terms, it's not clear yet that e-levy will make that much money. Another clue is that if we take the big telecom companies, so if you take MTN, which is the biggest MoMo operator in the country, and you find out that it makes roughly $200-something million from all the fees it charges. And now the government wants to impose a charge that operates similarly to how MTN makes its money, by charging you per transfer. And you say, well, how can the government then claim they can make $1 billion? Of course, the government is not only charging MoMo, they're also charging bank transfers. But it gives you some indication of why it may be difficult, given all the exemptions and all the other factors. Lastly, what does this mean for jobs? I mean, we can have a whole discussion on jobs, so I'm not going to do that. There's no time. But I wanted to point to one fact. This is a very interesting graph. I don't have the data for the last couple of years, but I just found it very fascinating that one of the biggest and most successful manufacturing entities that have entered into our terrain in recent years, Blue Skies, is a big fruit processing company. I found it fascinating that Blue Skies is actually increasing the number of casual workers and significantly reducing the number of permanent workers. And the reason they are doing that is because of uncertainty in the production environment and a lot of other factors. But this casualization is rarely understood and rarely monitored in our economy. I have been looking at the mining sector, where a lot of the mines are moving people from permanent or standard contracts to casual contracts. And often we talk about jobs and we kind of leave it at pure unemployment or unemployment. But I also see that when the economic factors become as they are, they can lead to casualization, which will distort the measurements of employment, because people don't say they are unemployed, but they live in very precarious circumstances. Their job security is heavily threatened. So the point I'm making is that just looking at unemployment and employment numbers alone is not very effective in understanding the trends in jobs that we are seeing, because growing job insecurity is not always reflected in employment numbers. If your contract is shifted from permanent to casual, yes, you are employed, but you are living in very precarious times. And we have a lot of people that are on commission basis. That's becoming an increasing feature of the Ghanaian economy. That rather than people not working, they are working in highly job insecure circumstances. A lot of companies that will hire you, but they will only pay you if you make a sale. A lot of law firms in Ghana now only pay associates if they bring in money. So there are a lot of precariousness in people's economic circumstances, even though they are purportedly employed. And that is an important point. And in raw terms, we are also seeing that overall job participation rates have dropped in the economy. We've dropped from when we hit oil and we were on a high in this country, 67%, to around 55%. So we are back to the decline that we saw during the energy crisis. And that means, therefore, that we seem to have a situation where crisis and jobs correlate quite significantly, more so than sometimes we think. And so it's likely that this crisis that we are experiencing will also affect job participation rates. My last point is that we have to find a way of doing good governance again in the context of policy independence. Everything I've said from the beginning was try to establish the fact that Ghana finds new source of financing and shifts aggressively there, but we don't pay attention to the structural foundations of the economy and of our governance system. And that's what we've done with moving aggressively into oil and gold and moving aggressively into borrowing on the capital markets and doing very little fundamentally to change anything on the ground. If we don't find a way to restore good governance, we're going to have a challenge. Let's remember that until we decided we're going to start borrowing a lot more on the Eurobond markets, rely a lot more on raw materials, we made a lot of our income through our relationships with bilateral and multilateral partners. It was a kind of new colonial arrangement in which they told us what to do. And if we did that, they gave us money that was cheap. We've tried to move away from that in 2006 when we decided we're going to drop out of the IMF program prematurely, and we're going to take our fate into our hands. But that policy independence comes with responsibility. So if the World Bank and the IMF and the rest are not telling you what to do, then somehow your ability to take those decisions on your own accord requires that there is some degree of scrutiny from the population itself. It's very simple. When I first returned to Ghana to get deeply involved in policy analysis and in policy critique, in those days, most decisions will require that some consultation is held. And usually the consultation will be at the instance of the World Bank and NIDA and all of these Oyibo organizations. And they will bring the ministry, they will bring civil society, we'll all debate, and then we will leave. But in the process, there was significant effort to ensure scrutiny of government policy. Then we said, no, that was neo-colonial. We really are not going to keep this. We're going to go Ghana beyond aid. And we started borrowing aggressively in the international market at a very high cost. So whereas IMF will charge you 2%, we will go and pay 9% to some British fund. We say that is not neo-colonial because we are still independent. We're just paying them our money. They are charging us through the roof, and that is fine because we have independence to set up JIDA and set up what do you call those things? Ghana Cares or Batampa, Dachin. We can do all of these things without any white person telling us how to do them, and that was great. True, but who is providing the scrutiny now? Because right now the challenge we have is that all these stuff that you keep hearing, Agenda 111, whatever, there's just no policy documents on them. A journalist recently wrote to the Ministry of Health asking for information on Agenda 111. And the Ministry of Health wrote back that they don't have the information in their custody. And why don't they have it? Because there's no policy document. And this is something that the World Bank would not have allowed. This is something that NIDA would not have allowed. Before you do single spine, there were documents upon documents, consultation upon consultation, modeling, analysis, workshops, conferences to think through them. Now we say, well, we don't want any white person briefing down our neck. We are a proud, independent, Black, emerging economic power. We are going to do that on our own. The problem is that there is no equivalent infrastructure that we've created to ensure that scrutiny. So the civil society doesn't really get told in any great detail what the government wants to do. People run the country as if it's their private property. Let me give you an example. We know that we need to monitor the implementation of this e-levy thing. Some people have said it requires some kind of electronic monitoring. Not all of us believe that because they think GIFs and GRA working together can do it. The problem is there's not a single document that describes what the government plans to do with monitoring. There is no single effort being made anywhere to bring the right minds in the country that understand revenue assurance, that understand the issues of digital payments, etc., to frame a model for us to monitor e-levy properly. Nobody has said that. What are the challenges? What are the issues? There's not a single paper that you can point to that lays out the challenges that the government may face and then outlines how the government intends to solve it for us all to debate and say, well, maybe this is how we should do it. Rather, what we hear constantly is, oh, GRA will handle it. And then opposition comes out and says, we've heard that the government wants to give $40 million of the money to some private company to come and do the monitoring, just as we've done with Kelly GVG and communication services tax. And you ask yourself, why can't you simply, in good faith, lay out the issues, write the policy paper, 20 pages, say, here is how e-levy is going to be implemented. Here are some of the challenges we anticipate in terms of potential circumvention or evasion. Here is some of the control. Here are some of the controls we think will be necessary. Here are the capacities that we will need as a country to monitor them. Here are some of those entities that have the capacity. Maybe GRA has or does not have the capacity. Maybe GIBS has or doesn't have the capacity. So we are intending to do this and that. They will not do it. They will remain extremely, extremely opaque. They will refuse to engage in good faith discussion with civil society, with people that are genuinely only interested in the good of the country to try and find solutions. They will be aided and enabled by a group of elites in the country that for some reason are unable to rise up to their obligations as an elite to question these things, to insist that no, publish the document, to insist that no, tell us exactly how you do it, to insist that no, GRA, be transparent. Now, if you have a country that is struggling to build basic scrutiny into its institutions, you are not going to be able to borrow money effectively, borrow money at the right rate, borrow money only when you need to borrow money. And when you've borrowed money, invest it in the areas that will lead to sufficient transformation so you have more resources to pay back. And you're going to continue being in this cycle where you borrow to the hilt, you then tell people we can't pay, they restructure, you start all over again, and we'll keep doing these cycles. And of course, we are growing our GDP in time, but we're not growing it fast enough. And we are now getting very close to economic crisis because we may default. And that might set us back many, many years. So my argument is that if we don't want the white person telling us what to do, then we as an emerging elite, as NUGS-CHINA, people that are highly educated with international exposure, we have to get in the game. We have to contribute structurally, constructively to the debate in our homeland, make efforts to contribute to debates on Facebook, on radio, on TV, wherever you get a chance, and ask questions about the government, be critical. Insist, but this one, where is the policy document? What was it that you were trying to solve? Why is it that you took this route? Does this make sense or not? Ask them to be transparent and open. Because if we don't, and the country continues to follow this path, yeah, we may make some progress. We may be very average in Africa. In some instances, we're slightly lower than the sub-Saharan African average, we'll be a little above. But I strongly fear that we will not be able to fundamentally transform our economy to the point where we'll get to the South Korea and the Malaysia and the Singapore that you mentioned in the brief that you sent to me when you asked me to make this presentation. So thank you very much, NUGS, and I look forward to an engaging Q&A.
In fact, I am lost for words, and I'm quite sure my colleagues are also amazed by the quantum of information we have received. Fellows, we have gotten to the point where we have gotten a reality check to the situation we have on the ground. This is our Ghana. This is our economic situation. These are the realities we are faced with. So we'll move right on to the Q&A section. I have seen Philip's hand up, so we will go by that route. If you have any question, you can please put up your hand. I will call you, you unmute, and then you can ask your question. I think we have some minutes, so we will give room for some questions. Make sure your questions are snappy, direct, and straight. Try and avoid a lot of preambles and trying to create a lot of scenarios and situations before you ask your questions. So, Philip, please unmute and then go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Mr. Simmons. So I'll be very, very quick about this. The statistics you presented earlier on portrayed when Ghana returned to democracy, and from 1993 onwards, there seemed to be a growth pattern that was set out in Ghana. Don't you think there could be some unconsidered confounding factors that were really contributing to the surge in growth? Probably, for example, maybe because we returned to democracy, investors' confidence was boosted and they therefore could now consider Ghana as a fertile ground to invest in, compared to when we were having multiple unstable periods of coups. So could there be certain things you're overlooking and in the relationship between democracy and and growth? Citing examples of countries that have really fared well, countries like Singapore and other countries that really didn't fly on the same path of democracy, but have made magnificent growth. don't you think probably democracy has been overrated, and we have tend to overlook other possible forms of governance that could have probably maybe spurred Ghana to growth? And then secondly, I want to hear your thoughts. Would it be justified to say that Ghana is actually suffering from resource scarce, or has joined the countries that have basically suffered from resource scarce and that disease? And then lastly, from what you've shared, what do you think will be Ghana? Where do you see Ghana in the next maybe 5-10 years if things should stay the same?
Thank you very much for these questions. No, you are right. I mean, I don't know whether everyone kind of understood your question, but your point was that if we take democracy as one variable, let's say as an independent variable, and then we take economic growth as a dependent variable, we'll be able to show that they are linearly correlated, or at the very least, obviously we cannot show causation, but can we show that they are very strongly correlated, or there could be variables that variables that are so aligned with democracy that is rather them than democracy that is causing the shift, or democracy leads to something else which rather leads to the growth. So there are these types of questions are only answered when you do a regression, and then you do your auto regressions, your co-integration tests and things like that. Very difficult to do, as you know. Those of you that are grad students, and most of you are grad students, so you know these are very challenging things to establish empirically. But I was not making an empirical point. I was not trying to say that, look, you've done some regression to establish that, you know, democracy leads to economic growth. I was actually saying that most people assume already, because of developmental economics and the turn in developmental economics to the view promoted by the likes of Hansun Jion and others, that most countries do not develop with democracy. So that has now become the mantra. The mantra is no longer that democracy leads to economic growth. If you look carefully at international development economics, particularly those that are not that the part of international development economics that's not dominated by neoliberal thinkers, you come to the conclusion that the current consensus is that most countries do not develop with democracy. So I was saying that in our case, we have something that looks like a counterpoint. It's not clear and emphatic, but it's in an interesting counterpoint. Could there have been other things rather than democracy that have happened in 1993 onwards that, you know, perhaps account for the growth in Ghana? Well, first we can look at Ghana in isolation and say, yeah, there could be other things that correlate with Ghana in isolation. So from 1993 onwards, we also started to enter into economy age, you know, and high digitalized situation, because the internet started off becoming popular around 1993, 1994, 1995, thereabouts. So that was significant, you know, tense. We've also seen global growth significantly accelerate as a result of increasing productivity, growth in certain sectors, not across the economy. Generally, productivity has not globally increased across the board, but in certain segments of the economy, and some of the countries that are were late in catching up, could inject a lot of capital resources into the economy in the form of technology that could have also been a boost. So we saw the telecom boom, for instance, happening in Ghana, you know, from the 1995 through to 2000, when we first saw the first private telecom companies in the rest. So yes, you could look for some other factors and pile them together and say yes. The challenge will come when you try to compare it to the rest of Africa, because those factors will not necessarily be Ghana specific. And I struggle to find Ghana specific factors from 1993 onwards that are not democracy related, right? Or as not significant as democracy. So we have to look for those factors. I don't think, if you look at environmental factors, probably not. Our ecological collapse in Ghana now is incredible. We've lost more forest cover over the last 2 decades than we lost for all our recorded history and things like that. So I would not be able to give you a rigorous answer, given the fact that this is a very empirical question. I haven't done a regression. I haven't done my co-integration test. I haven't done my VR auto regressions and all of that. So I don't know. Second question in relation to the Dutch disease and the resource case. The resource case is broader. The Dutch disease is very technical and very specific. It fundamentally focuses on, you know, the increase in the strength of your currency as a result of export competitiveness, then as a result of an injection of foreign currency due to an export boom. And you know the story of the Netherlands. When they discover gas, they start to export a lot of gas. It leads to significant inflow of foreign money. The currency strengthens. Because the currency strengthens, their export competitiveness in other areas other than oil go down. I don't think you can look at our history and empirically make those assertions. I don't see any evidence that our currency has strengthened. I don't see any evidence that our export competitiveness has eroded in other areas beyond oil. So I wouldn't say that disease, but resource scarcity is so broad that you can make a claim that it accounts for a part of our challenge, in the sense that oil money, gold money has created the conditions for Ghana not to require policy tutelage, not to require, has created a condition for Ghana to be able to be independent of the multilateral partners, so-called. And that has therefore meant that we are paying less attention to governance as a country, the quality of governance, the quality of the civil service, the quality of policy making, because we can get the money without going to do a dance before the World Bank, the IMF, and the rest. So I think in that regard, if you define define the resource case that broadly, you could be able to link some of that to the growing wealth in natural resources, extraction and exploitation, which we use to justify why we should borrow more. So when we go to the Eurobond markets and the rest, one of the reasons they give us money is because of this commodities boom, in which Ghana is a big participant as far as Africa is concerned. So yes, in that broad sense, I will accept that some degree of resource case has occurred. But a bigger one, I think, is the fact that Ghana's overall profile is attractive. And because our overall profile is attractive, we're able to attract a lot of resources with very little questions asked. And finally, the chickens have come home to roost.
All right, thank you very much. Rich D, please unmute and then go ahead. Please make it snappy for us so others can ask their questions.
Okay, thank you so much, moderator. Mr. Simmons, thanks for your presentation. My question is this. I've heard changing structure of the economy since President Kufuor's time. We still talk about changing structure of the Ghanaian economy. My questions are: one, how do we change the structure of the economy? How long will it take to change the structure of the economy? And is it the responsibility of only government to change the structure of the economy? What are your thoughts there? Thank you.
Yes, very profound questions. Obviously, not enough time to do justice to them. You are right. One of the most annoying phrases in the Ghanaian political lexicon is this talk about moving from the Gadgetsburg economy to some kind of highly diversified economy. To change the structure of the economy is very simple in terms of its meaning, right? It means that we need to diversify our export base and diversify our the domestic economy. To diversify the export base, you need to develop new competences and competitiveness in new areas. And we have to do an identification metrics. Those of you that follow Houseman, and I like Houseman. I mean, the people talk about the fact that the theory is not very grounded and the rest of it, but I think Houseman is a very simple way to look at it. Countries move from areas to area, economic area to economic area of competence through lateral movements. Very little effort, very little evidence that says that you can do vertical integration to do that. And all our industrialization policy focuses on vertical integration. So we say things like, oh, but why are we importing peanut butter when we have peanuts or we have groundnuts? And why are we importing refined petroleum when we have petrol? But that's not how it works in the world. I mean, we have enough historical data now to show that countries that produce a lot of wood don't necessarily produce a lot of furniture. And countries that produce a lot of rice don't necessarily make a lot of rice pudding. There's no correlation. So producing cocoa and making chocolate has no correlation. Let me explain why. Chocolate is a confectionery. So the closest thing to making chocolate is making toffees or making cakes. Growing cocoa is about farming. It's about land, water, people's cultural heritage and legacy, whether or not cocoa was grown in their area and whether or not their grandfather grew cocoa. What is the correlation between growing cocoa and making chocolate? There's no correlation. So if as a country, you keep talking about the fact that because we have cocoa, we must make chocolate, you are going to fail. And I think that's it's in that regard that Horstman is right. However, when you do a lot of lumbering, if you're a country that cuts a lot of trees, maybe because of that, you need a lot of source. And therefore, maybe because of that, you can begin to explore your advantages in having a captive market for source. And because of the fact that you have a lot of people that become very skilled in cutting trees. And that combination may create a new cluster where you make machine tools for cutting trees. So that lateral approach, where you look and say, because we do cocoa, maybe we're very good at doing cashew as well, because of historical factors, or because we built a mechanism for buying cocoa from villages, we can be able to create some kind of agricultural commodity complex. That thinking, I think, has been missing in our industrialization policy. So everything has been around vertical integration throughout, and it's not showing. The evidence shows it doesn't work. So if you have some cattle in the north, come and make a corn beef factory in Akosombo. It doesn't work, because making corn beef and having cattle are not that connected, regardless of what Exeter tells you. Now, I think that is the problem in the industrialization policy, which we need to look closely at. What are the lateral moves that we can make based on competencies being developed, given existing industries, and not focus on we have the raw material, we can make the final product. So that would be my argument in terms of changing the structure of the economy. I would say that the industrialization paradigm as a whole is not following the latest evidence. It's based on theories that have been circulating since the 1950s, and nobody has bothered to really question them. And I think our economists are also not doing too well when it comes to the theoretical aspect of the economic profession in that part of the world. I think there's a lot of empirical measurements and things like that. A lot of the publications that I see from Ghanaian economists tend to be of an empirical nature and trying to test specific things that have already been determined elsewhere. But I don't see enough effort to reorganize the theoretical foundation on which we are doing some of these policies, the actual strategic basis for them. Well, there's not enough debate that's deep enough. So when we talk about industrialization, nobody really asks, is the fundamental industrialization policy sensible? And you don't hear that. All you hear about is that we should do it. So almost every time you bring an economy, we should add more value to our products, we add more value to our products. But every evidence shows that Canada doesn't add value to a lot of the minerals that it exports raw. The biggest countries in the West who are also major commodity producers, Canada, Australia, the US, they export most of their raw materials raw. So that tells you that adding value to your raw materials is not something that fundamentally transforms economies. When the English were becoming major producers of wool, they were not the biggest producers of sheep. In fact, part of the New Zealand, Australian boom was exporting raw wool to Manchester and the like for them to create garments. And the garments industry in Belgium did not develop because Belgium was all of a sudden the source of raw materials for those things. So you have to look at what are the factors that lead to clustering. And that by that we mean the skill sets, the competence, and that cluster together in a particular domain of the economy to create a new area of competence, which then generates export competitiveness and truly transforms your economy. That's what everybody has done. Taiwan becoming a major silicon foundry of the world has something to do with the fact that silicon is found there. So I think that is the thinking that we need to bring on board. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, so this question is coming from Salifu Bans, and I think it coincides with a question that I actually wanted to ask. There's this paper that was written by one of my seniors at the University of Cape Coast, and he titled it, "Who Watches the Watchman? Who Watches the Watchman?" And by that, Salifu Bans is asking that, do you think we need the IMF now in the short to medium term to come out from the recent economic quagmire that we find ourselves? And by that, my question still holds, that who watches the watchman? Thank you.
Okay, so regarding the IMF, there's a strategic issue and then there is a tactical issue. Let me start with the tactical. We borrow money. Ghana has a fiscal deficit. What a fiscal deficit means is that when you collect all the revenue you can collect and you look at your expenditure, there is a mismatch. So Ghana will normally try and collect around $8 to $10 billion, thereabouts, from the economy, from people's taxes, from royalties, everything. It's about $10 billion maximum. Now, when we get $10 billion, we still go ahead and spend maybe $15 billion or $12 billion or something as massive as that. Now, when you do that, you have a gap. Now, the gap has to be filled by borrowing. You can borrow domestically by going to your own citizens and asking them to buy your bonds, which are treasury bills and the rest, which means to lend you money, or and your banks and everybody else and the rest. Or you can go international and borrow the money. If you borrow the money, it comes at a cost. There's an interest rate. IMF will give it to you for sometimes for no interest rate at all of about 2% maximum. Now, when they give you the money that you borrowed, let's say $1 billion or something like that at that rate, that's money you no longer have to go and borrow on the private market. So instead of paying 8% or 9%, you pay 2%. Now, they will then come and also try and poke their nose into your matters. Start asking you questions like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why are you doing Agenda 111? Have you actually, do you actually have the nurses and the doctors to fill 111 hospitals when about 10 hospitals that we built recently are still struggling to get nurses and doctors? And then you have to sit there and think and say, okay, yeah, but I think the 111 doctors, I'm come up with some charter plan and I will bring some private doctors or whatever. But you have to answer the question. You can't do what you do now, which is you announce Agenda 111. Journalists go around and do minister said. So-called elites in the medical professions are not able to come out and ask any sensible questions. Even though all of us are educated, most of you on this call are doing graduate programs. You all know it doesn't make sense if you are going to build 111 hospitals, but you have a problem with staffing because you cannot, given that you've made medical education largely subsidized, you cannot produce enough doctors. And given that you've made nursing education subsidized, you cannot produce enough nurses. It's just obvious that people will ask you the questions. Of course, we live in a culture where we just, for some reason, can't ask the critical questions. And those that ask the critical questions are all of a sudden said to be against or too known or whatever. But if you are dealing with IMF, they will ask you the questions. They'll say, this Agenda 111, that means 111 more hospitals. How will you provide staffing? How will you do this? Given that you already have issues with NHIA and you cannot pay for providers, how would that? They will ask you, okay, you have to sit there as a minister, spend nights having meetings with your technical team. The chief director has to convene this and write those documents and send it to them. And if you don't, they will be on your neck. And yes, that person may be some young person from the University of Notre Dame with only 3 years experience and at the IMF. But that person is not Ghanaian. He's not going to feel the sense of reticence and deference we feel when we can't ask our leaders hard questions. He's going to come and ask you the questions. Like we see some journalists ask our presidents when they go and have these interviews, because those things are obvious to people. We have a very complicated culture. But for some reason, we can't be critical, we can't be constructively critical. So my sense of it is that from a tactical point of view, yes, if you go to the IMF, you get it at a lower cost and at the cost of policy independence. You won't get the policy independence you have now. You have to answer critical questions. But that's not strategic. It does not change anything about the fundamentals, why you cannot balance your books and why you cannot borrow less and why your fiscal deficit is not less. It will not change those fundamentals because we've been doing the IMF now for 16 times, right? We've done the IMF for 16 times. In our history, we've gone to IMF 16 times. So clearly, it's not a strategic answer. The strategic answer, though, makes the IMF issue a red herring. So that is the issue. So you have to separate the tactical, which is that if you're going to keep borrowing money, then maybe you should consider some of the IMF money because it's cheaper. But then you should be willing to answer hard questions to some non-Ghanaians. On a strategic level, we've gone to the IMF 16 times. It hasn't changed our fortunes. Going to the IMF again won't change our fortunes. So that's the way that you have to understand the IMF situation. And the who, what, the watchman, I think is addressed in the same terms.
Thank you very much. Yes, fellow attendees, I have issued a notice in the chat box. Please refer to it. Salif Ubans, I guess your question that you wrote in the chat box have been asked. I will allow Razak to ask the final question. Then we will bring the meeting to a close. Razak, please unmute and then ask your question. Please, you have 30 seconds.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bryce, for such an insightful presentation. My question is, I read a book by a South Korean professor, Bad Samaritans, basically saying that virtually all developed countries use one ladder to develop through imposing tariffs, import substitution, capital control, trade control, and the rest. So I wanted to know whether those those ways that they employed in becoming developed, whether it is still relevant and how Ghana can tap into it.
Okay, so you are right that people like Hansion and others have made it now the mainstream. The mainstream consensus that neoliberal economics are not sufficient for development. Just simply watching the interest rate, watching inflation, those things are not enough. My only concern the concern I have with a lot of the developmental state theorists is that I don't think they are paying attention to Africa's economy or those countries that are lagging behind. They are paying attention to the details of the economy. See, I'm a policy analyst guy, right? So I read budgets and I read government documents in relation to policy. That's where my capacity comes from, not from fundamental econometrics or things like that, or even fundamental development economics. And when I look at policy in Africa, policy history and things like that, some of the things they claim don't match up. So I'll give you a very practical example. Look at the tariff history of Asia when they were developing and the current tariffs in Africa since the 70s. We are much more close economy than Asia when they were developing. Our tariffs are much higher. Have you ever tried to bring something through the Ghanaian ports? Have you ever imported some item to the Ghanaian ports and see the charges that you pay? That's way more than in China or in Indonesia or in those countries. So when they say that, the Africa has been forced to over-liberalize, I don't see that in the reality. I don't see that in the reality because in the reality, it's a very difficult place to do business. The taxes may be slightly lower in some respects, but they're not lower than Asia when they were developing. The tariffs are not lower than Asia when they were developing. The tariffs are still very high. So if your industry still cannot compete, then maybe it's not about tariffs per se, unless they want us to now send tariffs to 100%. So I'm struggling to understand the full empirical basis of the argument that is often made that, we are not using the instruments to protect infant industries. We are not closing our borders enough. We are not, getting the government more involved in economic management. I think we have. Look at our state-run enterprise in the 70s and the 80s, right? Ochampon came to power and nationalized everything again. We own 55% of all the gold mines we own. We tried that for a decade. And like China, some of the state-owned enterprises performed a little better, some were worse. But on the whole, our state-owned enterprises have performed worse than Asia. So I'm not too sure that the fundamental arguments they make about we being too neoliberal are actually true. I think we are very neoliberal in rhetoric and in areas where we shouldn't be neoliberal, but in those areas where we should liberalize, we are not very liberalized. So I think that matter we should perhaps all of us devote our lives to understanding it better. So when I look at the African economy, I look at Nigeria, I look at how often the central bank governor is interfering in the economy. Today you can't do this. Today you can do this. Today what? And we are very controlled. I can move. I run a business as well on top of doing this policy thing. How I'm able to move money from Europe and America without any paperwork being asked. It's not how I'm able to do it in Ghana. In Ghana, you have to fill paperwork. Sometimes you have to decide, the Bank of Ghana has to give approval. So we have a lot of controls in our economy still. We've had them for years. So I think that on the whole, what they are saying theoretically makes sense. That yes, a lot of these countries in the West had policies in which supported their industry and the rest. But I think the reverse is not true, that we haven't had those policies. I think that the true state of affairs is that we've executed them badly. Whether we are liberalizing or we are going the developmental state route, whether we are using policies that are neoliberal in nature or whether we are using policies that are primarily developmental, my experience is that all of them have been bungled. So for us, whether or not it applies to the rest of the world, I think for us in Africa, we should step back from the ideological debate and just look more inwards. I think our problems are more technical, managerial, and fundamentally technocratic than elsewhere. They're not primarily of the nature of structural strategy per se. It's about just the way we run our institutions. But that's just me. I think it's a very hard question, and we have to start figuring out these issues over the rest of our lifetime. So, Mr. Moderator, back to you. And I think you're muted. Maybe Fifi is having challenges with his device or internet.
Please, Honorable Barnabas, please can you take over?
Yeah, hello, I'm back. I hope I can be heard now.
Thank you, moderator.
Yes, thank God. All right, Mr. Bryce Simmons, before my network started messing up, I was saying that there are two key things we have to do now. I would want you to give your closing remarks to your presentation, and then you can announce your handles, which is your either official handles or your social media handles. So those who want to follow your works or to those who want to ask you personal questions and direct questions could reach out to you. Then the last one is that we have a citation for you, and that will be delivered by Ms. Millicent Afenyon. So please stay with us in the next 2 minutes so we do that. Over to you, Mr. Bright.
Thank you very much, Fifi. And I'm putting my Twitter handle and my blog online, and some of the issues around that was asked regarding the developmental state issue. I have an article on my blog. If you search it on Google or directly on the blog, you will find it. I think it's called The Apprentice State or something like that. And it tries to grapple with this issue of whether or not our development is because we've been too neoliberal and following all these Washington consensus and Paris consensus prescriptions, etc. In terms of my closing remarks, so to repeat, my handle and my blog is in the chat window. And if you go there, there is an article that tries to grapple with this very difficult issue of whether the way to develop is not to liberalize further, but rather to bring the government even more strongly into management of the economy. I think it's a deep question, and it's a question of our age and our times. So I encourage everybody to try and get to know the debate better and to read as much around it. There are some key major actors in that debate. The gentleman in Cambridge, the South Korean professor in Cambridge that Fifi mentioned, and then of course you've got the people from the libertarian wing in the US, especially the Mises Institute and others of that nature who push the neoliberal and the classical liberal agenda. Then of course you've also got the mainstream economics, which you find in places like Econ, NBER, etc. In terms of my last remarks, I think one of the things that imperils our development as a country in Ghana, we have what I call low information elite that is not aware of the big issues and the full span of arguments. So this is not talking about technical expertise. I mean, that's of course irrelevant to that kind of nation building project. But what I mean is that a lot of the issues that we are facing with are characterized by big debates. How should we handle the issues of mass employment? How should we handle the issue of the civil service? Should we expand it or contract it? My experience in some other parts of the world where I have stayed is that the mainstream elite, that's the highly educated people in business and etc., are aware of the debate. They may not be experts in it, but they are aware of the debate, and they know when one group of actors in the debate or participants in the debate are on the rise and when the others are on the decline. And our problem is that a lot of the elite are not aware of the big issues in Ghana, even though they think they are. So if we think of energy and energy sector, for instance, the big issues around tariff management and things like that. In the West, they'll be aware of issues to do with, say, critical race theory and whether we should allow it in schools or not. These big deals are well understood, and so whenever there is the ascendancy of one faction over the other, they tend to see it and they align accordingly, and that makes it important because the key actors in the states, the politicians and the rest, take them serious as an elite. I think our problem is that we are not aware enough of the big debates. What are the big debates in Ghana? So what I will encourage all of us to do is that as part of the elite, and remember, there are only about 1.something% of Ghanaians that have a university degree. So those of you on this call are part of the 1% in Ghana, whether you like it or not, right? What I'll encourage all of us to do is become more involved in understanding the debates in the major areas of our life: energy, education, health, and be less inclined to follow the discussions in the way that the media sometimes shapes it, because that doesn't really bring us back to the big debates. And those big debates, if you are interested, you can follow me on Twitter. I sometimes bring them up: state-owned enterprises, etc., etc. What are the big issues? And I think in doing so, we will create a real democratic state, because the politicians will begin to see that the policies that they are churning out, and there are critical and constructive voices that are willing to engage. And without that, I don't think we'll be able to reform our democracy. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Ms. Millicent, if you are on, please head right on to the citation and for Mr. Simmons, so we can wish him goodbye.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Mr. Simon Bright, on behalf of NUGS-CHINA, we present this citation to you to show our sincere gratitude for availing yourself as our special guest to our program, and also for your in-depth knowledge you shared with us. We thank you so much, and the citation will be sent to your office later on. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Millicent, and to everyone for the invitation. I'm very honored by it, and I look forward to further interactions as we all develop in our various professions and our commitment to our country.
Thank you very much. On this note, we will head on to the vote of thanks, but attendees, Mr. Bright Simmons will have to leave us because he has an important assignment he has to attend to immediately. So we cannot wish him goodbye and thank him for such a time with us. So
thank you so much. Bye.
Right, bye. Lady Nanadwa, if you are on, I didn't know Lady was part of your name, so you have double titles, Lady and Nana. So Lady Nanadwa, please give us the vote of thanks.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity. We'd like to thank God Almighty for bringing us to the close of such an amazing program. And to our speaker, it's quite unfortunate that he's not here, but we are grateful for taking time off his busy schedules to be with us today to educate us on the developmental state of the Ghanaian economy. And we really appreciate his invaluable time and all the efforts. And we are also grateful to the executives for coming together to bring us this program that is very educative and very intuitive to make us understand the state of our economy. We would also like to thank the National Executive for gracing the occasion, every chapter executive, all the members. I'm not sure we would have been here if we hadn't been around. So we'd like to say thank you to everyone and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lady Nanadwa, the only lady with double titles. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move to the final section, which is the closing prayer, I would say that on most occasions, after programs like this, we have people staying behind to have conversations. NUGS-Wuhan want to entreat that the conversation post this program will have to center around this conversation that we just had with the speaker. It's a profound conversation, and just as has been highlighted in the chat box session, uninformed elitism is one of the things that is disturbing our country. So if you are interested in staying on to have an unofficial conversation around Ghana's economy and how we ourselves can help to improve them in our own ways, you can stay on after the closing prayer is said. So Bafo, if you are on, please give us the closing prayer.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Shall we pray? Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for a successful program. In the name of Jesus, we've prayed. Amen.
Amen. Amen.